Hello and welcome to The Deduction, a Tax Foundation podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Hulehan, and today we are back with another episode, and my co-host, Erica York, is here. We are also joined by Manish Bhatt, Senior Policy Analyst here at Tax Foundation. Manish, this is your first time on the show. Have you done a podcast before?
I've done a couple of podcasts, yeah, but my first one with you all, I'm excited.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you on. So we're breaking down property taxes. I know property tax bills are rising quite a bit for some people, and a lot of people are looking for answers. And I know some people even have talked about wanting to abolish the property tax, and we maybe don't think that's the best idea. We'll see. But Erica, could you kick us off here with the first question?
Yeah. So, Manish, my first question is actually two questions. First, can you walk us through the factors that have contributed to the rise in property values? And then second, talk about how that affects property taxes.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a great place to start. So I think there's a variety of factors from the amount of inventory in the market, costs of building supplies over the last few years, the supply chain issues that we saw from several years ago. But one of the most important or interesting things that in my work is sort of the rise in remote and flexible work. So the boom towns of old that we're used to reading about in history books have really turned into the Zoom towns of today. And that has certainly contributed to these inventory issues and these valuation surges that we've seen in the last several years. And how has that affected your property taxes? Well, if you live in a jurisdiction where property values are rising rapidly and your government does not necessarily adjust rates down, you could be facing a higher property tax bill either this year or in the coming years.
So why is there this growing discontent over property taxes, and what are some of the common problematic solutions that people are proposing?
Well, I think when we deal with the property tax, it is possibly the most transparent of taxes. If you own property, you likely know how much you pay in property taxes every year down to the cent. I couldn't tell you how much I paid in sales taxes last year, but I do know how much I paid in property taxes. And we also live in many jurisdictions where you can challenge your property tax bill. You can challenge the amount you owe. You can challenge the valuation. And so we are used to having this familiarity with the property tax. You certainly can't go to the store and refuse to pay the sales tax, but you can challenge your property taxes. We have this relationship also where we do trust our local government. I think it's important to say that property taxes are largely funding our local governments, our schools, our roads, and the services that we use day in and day out. And we have this relationship with our local government where we tend to trust our local government. We look at our local government as the least wasteful, yet we still dislike the property tax the most in general. And in recent years, really since 2020, we've seen property values skyrocketing almost 27% faster than inflation. And that is a huge, huge surge. And again, just going back to Erica's first question, that could yield a higher property tax bill. And there's no question that the cost of local government has gone up. There's no question about that in recent years. But has it gone up to the extent that we've seen valuations rise in some jurisdictions 40, 50, 60%? Has it gone up 40, 50, 60%? Are you getting more or better government for that? And that's if you want it. So there's some real questions and concerns when it comes to rising property taxes. But overall, it is a good tax. And for those reasons, it's worth reforming. Unfortunately, there's a lot of problematic solutions that are being proposed. Kyle, you mentioned some places are considering eliminating the property tax entirely. When property taxes comprise over 70% of local government revenue, imagine what could happen to your schools and your local services if property taxes are eliminated completely. Other jurisdictions are considering caps on assessments or how much valuations can rise from one year to the next. That causes some real economic distortions in the marketplace. Other jurisdictions are considering, okay, well, if we're not going to cap assessments, let's cap the tax rate. And at first blush, that might make sense, but if you really think about things, capping the rate does nothing to stop surging valuations or to combat that. Other states have considered homestead exemptions where you exempt a large portion of a home's property's value. And that really just causes a shift in the market. You're going to get the revenue from someplace. You might not get it from homeowners, but you might get it from businesses. You might get it from renters. And so there's a lot of plans out there, I think, that reflect the urgency of the need to reform the property tax, unfortunately, a lot of these solutions could do more harm than good.
Real quick, I'll follow up. We had this opportunity to chat a little bit about what you thought about property taxes the other day, and we talked about there is something in property taxes that affects renters. Could you address that real quick and just follow up on that? That property taxes do affect renters in a certain way. I thought that was super interesting.
Absolutely. And it's a really important concern. So, as I just mentioned, the homestead exemption, where you're exempting a portion of a home's value. Again, when you have such a large amount of local revenue coming from the property tax, it will need to get made up somewhere else. Oftentimes, with these homestead exemptions, it just makes it easier to raise taxes on commercial property. When you live in a jurisdiction that classifies multi unit apartment buildings as commercial property, those tax bills go up. The property owner doesn't necessarily absorb those. They pass those on to the renter in the form of a higher rent payment. Some places are considering taxing owner-occupied primary residences. So I live in a home, that's my owner-occupied primary residence at a lower rate than, say, a second home that someone might own. And we do have, in many places in this country, housing shortages. And so if you're taxing a secondary residence at a higher rate or applying a sort of preference to owner-occupied homes, you're likely, or at least possibly, pushing that burden onto a renter who's now living in that house, really for no reason. That renter is not absorbing more local services. They're not using the school systems more or less. But we somehow feel like it might be worth taxing them more, and it does benefit owner-occupied homes to the detriment of renters who, in some cases, may be least able to afford buying a home.
That's super interesting. I appreciate you pointing that out. As someone who rents, I think that this is pretty important. And I know that there are a lot of other people renting there. And you wouldn't think, the property tax factors into anything that you do, but it clearly does.
Yeah, you don't get the same property tax bill as a homeowner, but it's still perhaps impacting the monthly rent payment that you have, and it's just built in. Um, Manish, I want to go back to something you said earlier. You said the property tax is a good tax. Can you explain that? Why do economists think that a property tax is a more efficient way to raise revenue? And then you kind of said earlier too, if you're not raising revenue through the property tax, you're going to be raising it through some other type of tax because the local government, the state government has to have that tax revenue in order to support the spending that it does. So if we move away from the property tax, what are the bigger risks of moving to less efficient types of taxes?
Absolutely. And the word efficiency is absolutely right. The reason the property tax is a good tax, and let me caveat that with a well-structured property tax is a good tax, is because it's economically efficient. We see property taxes doing less harm than alternate revenue streams and alternate taxes. We can look at data from Indiana, for example. So Indiana explored what would sort of a wholesale replacement of the property tax with various types of taxes. The first was an income tax. And what they found was state gross state product would decline by 2.8% as opposed to maintaining the property tax. They considered what would happen if they shifted entirely to a sales tax to replace all property tax revenue. And there too, they found that revenue would fall by 2.7%, or product rather. Now, that's one study. There's international studies that show the same thing because not all taxes are created equal in terms of efficiency, in terms of distortions in the market. Property taxes also tend to have less of an effect on decision making. So in this case, we're talking about location. So some taxes you might consider, I don't want to move to a state because they have an income tax, or if I'm a business, the business tax climate's not friendly. But generally, we don't see people making those same decisions based on property taxes. The property tax also aligns really well with the benefits that we get from our local governments. Again, when structured well. And the last thing I would add here is that, again, property taxes are highly transparent and they do correlate to the services that we get. What does that do in the long run? It increases our property value. So when we pay property taxes and our schools get better, our local services get better, our property values tend to rise. And that's really due to the fact that we're paying for local services that are then benefiting us in the end in terms of a higher property value. So it is more efficient. It is less distortionary than other taxes. And again, a well-structured property tax is a good tax.
All right, so I want to follow up on this real quick. I have an uncle who is, feeling like he's paying too much in property taxes and he's not really getting anything out of it. Like, I don't have kids to go to school anymore. I don't do this. This is kind of a common theme I hear. I even see it online. So, could you kind of just break that down in the most simple way of just saying, like, basically, when the schools are better, everything's better, then you're getting more out of that. Your property value rises. Is that right?
That's right. So, what's the one of the first questions that you look for when you're looking for a home? You look at the school district. Even if you don't send your kids to local school district, we homeschool our child. Many people might put their kids in private schools or parochial schools. They're not availing themselves of local public school, but a good, strong public school is good for a community and is good for your property values. And the same can be true if you live in a jurisdiction where you can't count on the police to come to your house or the fire department to come to your house or the roads to be plowed. Well, guess what? Your property values probably aren't going to be as high as in those places where they have the services to support those values. And so even if you don't avail yourself of every service available by the local property tax, you are still getting a benefit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so we're gonna get into two technical terms here that we might have to break down a little bit for people. So there are levy limits and then these narrowly tailored circuit breakers. So how could those provide relief for homeowners without distorting the housing market?
Going back to what we talked about earlier about the different relief mechanisms out there and the inefficiencies that they cause, levy limits, when structured well, represent sort of the most neutral way of providing property tax relief. So, what is a levy limit? Well, a levy limit is really a collections limit or a revenue limit. It just constrains the ability of government budgets to grow year over year over year unchecked. So, what's happening now if you live in a state that does not employ levy limits is as valuations have surged, local governments have gotten a windfall because now they have more money in their coffers due to the property tax. So, what levy limits seek to do is set the revenue goals at an appropriate level, adjusting for things like population growth and inflation. And then when values surge, we roll back the rates that are applied to property. And that will keep the revenue in check. Now, some people say, well, the real concern with property tax is it might quote, tax people out of their homes. And so you could use what's called a circuit breaker or a targeted relief mechanism for certain populations, say low income taxpayers, to make sure they're not priced out of their home, that they can, by virtue of taxes, that they can stay in their home. So levy limits are a fancy way of saying we're going to control the growth in government to make sure that we are not getting a windfall when values rise. There's rollback provisions and rate reductions to make sure that government's adequately funded, but not overly so.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's bring it all together. Property taxes are generally a good tax if they're well structured, but people tend to not like them partly because they're so transparent and you know what you pay, and also partly because we've seen property values rising, so tax bills might just be going up because of that underlying increase in the price. What should happen? What should states be doing? What are good reforms that they should implement and prioritize rather than some of these other ideas you've talked about that have unintended consequences or mean that states are relying on even more harmful and distortionary tax types?
Yeah, so legislatures around the country are grappling with this very question, and there is a real sense of urgency with lawmakers to provide relief to taxpayers. And that urgency can be a good thing, but what urgency can also bring is hasty decision making that doesn't consider market distortions and doesn't consider these shifting tax burdens that we talked about earlier. So what lawmakers should really focus on is understanding what relief mechanisms their state currently employs and making sure they're not shifting the burden, making sure they're not unjustly penalizing renters through this process or Main Street businesses who happen to own a brick and mortar property, and pursue strong levy limits that are transparent, that are largely neutral, and bring the rising valuation issue under control by controlling the growth in government. And it sounds easy for me to say here, but to be totally transparent, it is the right approach. And a well-structured property tax is a good tax, yet it continues to be misunderstood and maligned. And I hope this podcast helps people understand that there is some real value in the property tax.
I hope so too. And I want to follow up with one question that I see online and I even hear from family members. It's like, my home is paid off, but I'm still having to pay my property tax. Why am I having to rent my home from the government? Can you walk us through that misconception and how it ties into this, like the economic efficiency and the growth and the housing affordability issues, and maybe like what someone in that position should think about to maybe change their perspective on the property tax?
Yeah, and I hear that all the time, the idea that I'm renting my house from the government. And I can understand why people think that way. You purchase a home, you spend a lot of money on the home, maybe it's your savings, you've saved up a long time and now you have to pay the government a fee every year just to live in the home you already pay for through a mortgage. I understand. But the reality of it is property taxes are less harmful to the economy than other taxes. That's number one. And number two, we need to fund local government. If we are living in a place where over 70% of local government revenue comes from the property tax, eliminating the property tax, the most efficient of taxes, is not helpful to you as a taxpayer, and it's not helpful to your community. And if we value things like our schools and our parks and our roads and all of the different services that our local government provides, it needs to be funded. And we can fund it through the least harmful way of doing so. It's not renting your property from the government. It is paying for the benefit received. Every day, when you pick up the phone and call 911, and someone comes to your house to respond to an emergency, they're doing so because you paid a property tax.
And that's why the property tax is important, folks. You need it. We need this to have the services, to have schools, to have many of the different things that you utilize on a daily basis to have good roads. It's a very important tax, and I think it's very misunderstood. And Manish, we are really grateful here that you were able to come on and break this down for us. You're a total pro. This may have been only a few podcasts you've done here, but I'm hoping to speak like you. And I also think I need a bow tie as well.
You're too kind. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks for being on the show today. And before we sign off, I just want to say if you have any burning questions, like on property taxes, you can send them our way. You can drop a comment here on YouTube. You can also email us at podcast@taxfoundation.org. You can always slide into our DMs at Deduction Podcast on Twitter. Thank you for listening.